The Torn Fairy, an action-adventure fantasy romance, written by Mira Crest, narrated by Ivy Starlight. Chapter 1. It was the end of a long day, in a long week, in a long month, in a year that felt as if it had gone on forever. I put the last book from my cart on the shelf, and all I was thinking about was how nice it would be to go back to my room in the apartment I shared with 2 other girls and to simply be done with the world. Of course, that was when I heard the scream. I turned, every nerve in me suddenly twisted up hard, and instinctively I scanned the mostly empty library for the cause. I found it almost instantly in the form of a little girl seated in the children's area. She was small and chubby with her dark hair done up in pigtails. She had a book clutched to her chest as if she were terrified that it would be taken away from her, her round face screwed up and turning red. "Stop it!" I wanted to shout at her. "Stop it right now! You're gonna get—" A slender woman in an expensive-looking dress hurried over to the little girl, kneeling beside her and touching her hair gently. I couldn't hear what she was murmuring to the little girl, but slowly the girl relaxed, her shoulders coming down and her face opening up a little. When the little girl relaxed, it was even easier to see the resemblance between the two. They had the same dark hair, the same sweet face, and unexpectedly, it made my chest tighten up. "Mom, did you ever touch me like that? Did you ever look at me the way she's looking at her daughter?" I shrugged angrily. What a stupid question. I was 22 years old, and Mom had been dead for 6 years. The years before her death passed in a haze of poverty and sorrow, and more often than not, it had been me comforting her. Is that really true, though? Did you always comfort her? I pushed the thought away. Thoughts like that were dangerous, and thinking about my mother at all, well, that was always dangerous. Sometimes I felt her loss like a great dark hole in the center of my chest, so black and deep that it could suck away everything good inside me, taking it with her when she went. Other times, all I felt was terrible heat, something that would burn me up in a heartbeat if I wasn't careful to keep it cold. "It's all right, sweetie. We can take the book with us, you see. The nice lady at the desk will check out the book and we can borrow it for 3 whole weeks. Isn't that great?" "But we have to give it back?" The little girl was plaintive and I flinched a little. I remembered that too. When I was a kid, it was always bags of government food, fast food when we could afford it, and long nights in apartments that sometimes didn't have power. I loved reading. Loved sinking into the worlds that felt way better than the one I lived in. But if we couldn't afford dish soap, we certainly couldn't afford books. "We do, sweetheart, but if you like the story very much, maybe you can save your money and buy it yourself to keep at home." The girl looked at least somewhat appeased, but then I saw a man approaching. There was a slight frown on his face, and as much as I hated it, there was still a small part of me that measured how big he was, how there was a slight tension in his body, and how easily his large hands could crawl into fists. God, I was a sad case sometimes. I told myself that it was none of my business, but I straightened a shelf that didn't need to be straightened, watching the family out of the corner of my eye. My phone was supposed to be in my locker, but instead it was in my pocket. If I needed to, I could dial the police for help. But as well-dressed as the family was, maybe they wouldn't believe me. Maybe they would think I was just making trouble and it would go all the worse for, "Everything okay?" The man's tone was like a splash of cold water. I had expected it to be irritable or even angry. I had expected some casual cursing and a hand wrapped around the little girl's wrist. Instead, there was only concern in the man's voice as he looked at his wife and glanced down at his daughter. The woman nodded, blowing some air past her lips and smiling at him. Something about that smile dazzled me. She was in love with him. It was a normal day in their normal lives, and this was what love looked like talking in the library. Oh, yeah, she's fine. We're just having a talk about the library and how she has to at least let go of the book to go check it out. The man's face smoothed out, and while he wasn't really my type, I could see how handsome he was in his wife's eyes. He looked down at the little girl with a slight grin, reaching down to tussle her hair. I noticed with a slight pang that she didn't flinch away from him at all. Come on, Pumpkin, the sooner we get that book checked out, the sooner we can be at home reading it, right? The girl's face brightened up, and she nodded, climbing up and giving her father her free hand. All three of them turned toward the circulation desk, and as their daughter chattered cheerfully about the book she had found, I saw her mother slide her hand into her father's free hand. No, Laura, do not do this. Do not cry in the middle of the library. You are screwed up, but you are not so screwed up that you are going to make a scene right at your place of employment. It was a close thing, though. My thoughts were abruptly pulled back from my own screwed-up family back to Franklin. Had I ever touched his hand so very trustingly? I wasn't sure. I remembered time after time reaching for him and him pulling away coldly, or else turning so hot and demanding a response that I couldn't give him. Frigid bitch, he had finally said. You think you're going to get a man without putting out? Even in my memory, I shied away from the crudeness and the brutality of it. It had hurt coming from a man that I thought was going to be my knight in shining armor. In the end, I was left to my tears and reduced to sleeping in the shelter after he kicked me out. Anyhow, I decided he had done me a favor. It's not real. None of it is. And the sooner I get that in my head, the safer I'll be. No more chasing illusions. What's behind them is pure danger. Still, even as I gathered up my things and clocked out, there was a part of me that needed to linger just long enough to watch the family I had spotted head towards their car. They looked happy. Had my own family ever looked so happy? I doubted it. My mother was a mess, married too young, and my father had been a monster. You're better off out of it. Saying it out loud didn't really convince me of it, but I had done it enough that at least it felt convincing. The air was crisp and cool, a welcoming fall after a brutal summer, and I didn't even mind the fact that the cool breeze cut through my skirt and my light jacket easily enough to give me goosebumps. I tilted my head up to look at the moon, and for just a moment, I was contented. I wasn't happy, but who is? I had the moon and a pleasant walk home, and that was all that mattered to me. Of course, that was when the woman stepped into my path. She was old enough to be my mother with stringy white hair that was untidily stuffed under a knit cap. Despite the relatively warm night, she was bundled up as if it was already winter, and she came closer to me, her eyes dark in the evening light. Miss, I'm sorry. I wouldn't ask, but can you spare $2? I swear, I just need $2. Well, so do I. I did, most weeks. I cut things pretty close to the line, and that meant that $2 meant the difference between eating canned tuna and eating a slice of white bread. Sorry, I don't have any cash. Most panhandlers would have been warded off, but this woman looked as if she was going to cry. She didn't budge out of my path on the sidewalk, and she swung her arms restlessly as if she were some kind of fretful tree. Please have a heart, all right? It's been really bad out here, really bad. I'll bet. I just need to get home. I tried to edge my way around her, but she seemed to fill the space. Despite my best efforts to avoid it, she caught my gaze again. Miss, please, I'm begging. It's been so hard, and my daughter, she's sick. Daughter? Damn it, I should have known better than to engage, and she brightened up. Yes, miss, my daughter. She's at a hospital in Belleville. I just need to get bus fare to go to her, please. She's really sick, miss. I knew that was probably a lie. There was something practiced about the woman's tone, like she told this story all the time. She probably would have told me anything if it got her enough cash to do whatever it was she really wanted to do. I couldn't help it. I wanted to cry with frustration, but I reached into my backpack to pull out my wallet. The only thing in there besides my ID was a $5 bill, and without thinking too hard, I snatched it up and shoved it at her. Here, take it. Thank you, thank you. Just leave me alone. She wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth, and she took off at a fast trot, as if afraid I might change my mind. Slowly, I put my wallet back in my bag, and I tried not to feel so angry about what had just happened. I was definitely going to be eating toast and beans if I was lucky this week. If I wasn't, it would just be the toast. I tried to shake off the feeling of despair that clung to me, but just as I started to walk again, I heard a low and sardonic laugh coming from the small stand of poplar trees to my right. Chapter 2. Did you want to hear the poor old lady beg then? I turned to look at the guy who was only now moving into the light of a street lamp so I could see him better. He was a big guy, broad through the shoulders but lean, and I was startled by how handsome he was. He was fair, and under the black t-shirt he wore, I could see how his muscles strained the fabric. Good-looking, and from what I knew about good-looking guys, probably full of themselves, thinking the world wanted their opinion. Well, I certainly didn't. I just want to get home. I started to walk past him, but he fell into step next to me as if I invited him to do so. God, why had I stopped carrying mace? Home's a funny thing, isn't it? Is that where you're really going? I eyed him warily. Like you know anything about where my home is. He shrugged, and for a moment some of that tough guy facade dropped, just long enough for me to see something that made me look twice. Then he straightened as if he had never been there, and my guard went up again. I know that home is a long way away and a long time ago for too many people. From the way you treated that poor woman, I have an idea of how far away it might be for you. I felt a hand squeeze around my heart. Some days I felt as if I was just a walking wound, something that I did my very best to hide from the rest of the world. He was right. Home was long ago and far away, and while it might be a shattered place with nothing but pain left in it, I still wanted it and missed it so very badly. Don't think you know me. He shrugged again, and for some reason I had the idea that he liked this conversation as little as I did. Well, then why was he still walking with me? I want to ask you something. Can I stop you? I'm afraid not. How brave are you? I had to laugh at that. What a goddamn dumb question. What a dangerous one. It brought back a tidal wave of memories all rushing down on me as if they had just been waiting for the chance to come crashing down. I remembered hiding from my father, the last dark conversations I had with my mother. I remembered running out of the apartment so that Franklin wouldn't be able to get a hold of me. Sometimes it was a toss-up on whether being on the streets scared me more than being with Franklin, but the truth was I was afraid of both. I'm the farthest thing from brave, but look, if you're gonna mug me, I'm not gonna mug you, calm down. In the history of the world, has telling someone to calm down ever worked? A ghost of a smile wisped across his face, and for some reason it made my heart beat a little harder. I couldn't be this ridiculous, could I? He started to say something, but then a man melted out of the darkness beside us. Suddenly, I could easily compare my reaction to the strange man asking me all the terrible questions with what I would have felt normally, because now fear choked me. I fell back, scanning the ground for anything that I could use as a weapon, but as easily as anything, my companion stepped forward. One moment the man was extending a hand with a knife toward us, and the next the knife was sent scattering across the ground. The man drew back, clutching his hand and swearing, and my companion laughed softly. There was a promise of something dark in that laugh, of broken bones and ruptured blood vessels, and that was enough for the man who would have attacked us. He took to his heels, and my companion inclined his head politely.
Come on, then.
We should call the police.
And have them do what?
They could catch him, arrest him.
Do you truly have faith that they would?
I remembered all those hushed and tearful calls to the police answered with concern, answered with scorn or indifference. But they all amounted to the same thing, precisely nothing. I shrunk back in on myself, wrapping my arms around my body. I felt small and strangely humiliated on the road just then, and I felt at the same time a kind of fury rising up in me. They would do nothing for me.
Most likely you come from a regrettable world, to say the least.
He spoke like a prim schoolteacher disapproving of a class of rowdy children, and reflexively I glared at him. Like where you come from is any better? He spared me a single glance sharp as the best kitchen knife. We were passing underneath a streetlight just then, and I could tell that his eyes were green like cat's eyes. They weren't particularly kind, but I stood my ground. I might not be brave, but I didn't run every single time either.
You know absolutely nothing about where I come from.
I know that you don't learn to disarm a man without a knife unless you need to. I startled him, I could tell. For a moment there was something ugly in his expression, something that almost made me flinch. But then to my shock he looked away. He looked ashamed of himself, and for some reason that only made my heart ache more.
You are not wrong.
Would you even say that if I was right? I didn't know where that insolence came from. If something like that had crossed my lips with my father, I would have found myself on my rear, my face stinging with a slap. Instead, that only made the strange man I was walking with laugh a little with a rueful sound.
No, you're right. My home is not what it once was.
Well, join the damn club, I guess.
I'd rather not. Tell me, what do you believe in?
I gave him a wary look. Is this the lead up to you asking me to join some cult? Was that even a real mugger?
No, and yes, he was real. Would you like me to go back and find him to show you?
I had an image of this big man retrieving my mugger as if he were a cat bringing back a mouse, and I had to choke off another bit of laughter. This night was turning into something more than passing strange. No, God, no.
Then answer, what do you believe in?
What in the world could I say to that? I knew that the answer that I wanted to give was the one that I had been fed to in my favorite fairy tales and the secret movies I watched over and over again late at night and the books that even now were stashed under my bed. I knew the answer, and for one terribly foolish moment, I wanted to give it to him. The good sense inserted itself and I shook my head. I wasn't an idiot, no matter what this man might think. I had been hurt too many times before, far too much, and that was an answer I would never give again. Instead, I lifted my chin and gave the next best answer I could, the one I could almost believe sometimes. I believe in myself.
And what are you to believe in yourself? You look like a small woman to me. Pretty enough with your black hair and rainwater eyes, but you can't even fend off a single man with a knife. Are you so very impressed with yourself?
I gritted my teeth. You are the one who asked. What am I supposed to say? What is the one utterly true answer that you would have accepted? His answer was swift and simple.
True love?
I let out a harsh bark of laughter, even as something inside me lurched unsteadily. Don't make me laugh. His gaze was steady.
You don't look like you're laughing much, Laura.
God, because it makes me want to cry. How the hell can you say something like that? How can you believe in some stupid, flimsy excuse to bind yourself to another person?
What's hurt you so?
The thread of sympathy in his voice was somehow worse than the scorn that had been there before. I knew that I should be getting away from this freak as fast as I could, going up to my sad little room in my apartment to study for a marginally better life, but instead I rounded on him, throwing my arms wide. Well, why don't you take your pick? My mother committed suicide because she married the wrong man. My father knocked me around. My boyfriend was a piece of shit that probably has to wear a tracking device on his ankle. What's true love ever done for me? He was quiet for a moment, and I thought that he might simply drop his tail between his legs and slink away. He looked like he might have wanted to. Instead, he shook his head, and for a moment, he looked almost regretful.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry that your life has been so hard, and I'm sorry that I am about to make it harder.
What? What the hell? I choked off a shout as his hands closed around my wrist. Some absent part of me noticed how hard his hands were, how callous they were, even as he held me with an odd degree of gentleness. As careful as he was being careful not to bruise me, even as I tugged and tried to get away.
I am sorry.
With that, he stepped backward, taking me stumbling with him. One step was on land, and the next, I was falling, and all around me was a rich green light that made me think of oak leaves with the sun shining brightly through them, of endless summer, of waking up the first day of summer vacation. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out, and then the only real thing in the world was my hand in his, and something in my very blood that urged me forward. I was just beginning to panic, to lose my mind, but then my foot landed on the ground again. Only this time, instead of hard asphalt, it was soft grass, and instead of buildings around us, it was a forest. What the hell? Chapter 3.
Not hell. Far from it. This is Illiros. This is home.
He was still holding my hand, and now finally I managed to tear it away from him, stumbling back a few steps. I stared. On the street in front of my apartment building, he had been a good-looking guy in jeans and a t-shirt. Handsome, sure, but there wasn't anything really special about him. Now in a forest clearing where the only light was a red moon that soared overhead, far larger than the ones I was used to, he was far different. Instead of a t-shirt and jeans, he was dressed like some kind of musketeer in a slashed jacket, tight trousers, and sword at his side. It should have looked ridiculous, like some guy from the Ren Fair with a bunch of posters of hot girls riding dragons on his walls at home, but somehow it wasn't. He didn't look ridiculous. He looked dangerous. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize again, maybe to tell me something else, but I knew when enough was enough. He had saved me from a mugger, and maybe I owed him, but I did not owe him enough to stand here like some kind of lamb led to slaughter. I spun on my heel and dashed away from him, holding up my arms to protect my face from being slashed by low-hanging branches. My shoes were far too flimsy to deal with the woods, and I had never really been out of the city before. I was terrified of how dark the night was without the light from the city, but it didn't matter. Right then, I had two goals. First, I had to get away from whoever it was that was dressed up like a damn knight of the round table, and second, I had to find my way home. I ran as hard as I could, and my thoughts circled around inside my head like a dog chasing its own tail. It's impossible. It's not possible. I can't be here. Well, here I am. Whether it was my distracted thoughts or my panic that led to what happened next, I couldn't tell. One moment I was running headlong through some kind of fairytale forest, and the next, something had caught me around the waist and lifted me up off the ground. I shrieked with panic, and I glanced down into the face of something with eyes like lanterns and far, far too many teeth in its wide mouth. It was enormous, twice as tall as a man, though it was shaped like a man, and it stood on two legs. It was covered with a kind of sharp and musky fur that dug into my skin, and when it growled, it was the stuff of nightmares. "Put me down!" I managed to pull back enough to land a hefty kick to where I imagined its midsection was, and to my grim satisfaction, I heard a whiff of air escape its lungs. It dropped me, and for one brief moment, I thought that I had broken free. Then it pushed me to the ground, one enormous paw-like hand planted firmly on my chest as its broad face came up to investigate me. The yellow eyes never blinked, and I flinched as the sharp teeth seemed to snap inches from my nose. I was just getting ready to try to pick the damn thing again when a voice broke through.
Hey, big man, leave her alone. She's not the one you want. She's not the one who you think she is.
I turned my head to see the guy who had gotten me into this mess coming up to us. He moved cautiously like a man approaching a large feral dog. I suppose I had been hoping for another trick like the one that had disarmed the mugger, but there wasn't. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the monster that had me, his hands open and far away from the sword he carried at his side.
I know you miss her, but that's not her, I promise. Just let her go. You'll find who you're looking for, but that's not her.
For a moment, I thought that the monster that was holding me to the ground was actually going to back off on the basis of what the man was saying, but then it shook its head as if it were shaking off a gnat, and then it roared. I could barely see anything in the rush of tangled fur and the fury of claws and teeth, but then I saw a flash of silver, a sword being drawn as easily as a man might pull out a penknife. There was an arc of flashing light and then a howl of pure despair. I struggled up to a sitting position just in time to see the monster go screaming off into the woods, and my two-time rescuer leaning down, wiping his sword on the grass. There were still a dozen questions in my mind, the most significant one concerning where in the world I was, but at the moment there was only one I could ask. Who are you? For a moment he hesitated. It was strange. It was as if the answer did not come so readily to him, and instead of having it on the tip of his tongue, he had to search some deeper place for it.
I am Mal Amel, and this is Illiros, my home.
He said it as if it should have explained everything. For him, it probably did, but for me, it was just a bunch of words. No, you need to do better than that. Where am I? Why was I brought here? What right do you have to kidnap me like this? He flinched as if I had landed hard blows on him with my fists rather than simply asking him what anyone would have asked him.
You'll get your answers, I swear. But you must promise me that you will not run away again. These woods are very close to the city wall, but they have become very dangerous.
What was that thing that attacked me?
Who?
I beg your pardon?
Not a what, a who. That wasn't some nameless monster.
It sure looked like one. The man suddenly looked sad, and I would feel sorry for him if I hadn't been brought to some dangerous woodland right out of a demented Alice in Wonderland acid trip. I waited, and when he answered, it wasn't in the least satisfying.
He does not sleep, he does not eat, and if the world were different, or if it were not a magical compulsion he is under, he would be dead by now.
And there are others like him?
Many. They used to live in the forests outside of the city, just normal people.
I frowned. Normal people don't just turn into monsters.
Well, these are hardly normal times.
You have an answer for everything, don't you? He hesitated.
I have very few answers, I'm afraid. Will you come with me now?
I didn't want to, but after seeing the teeth on the thing that he said wasn't a monster, I knew that I had no choice, not really. Still, I was reluctant to put my trust into the man Mal, who had, after all, kidnapped me. Give me a reason to trust you. He scowled at me, and while a part of me shuddered at the kind of damage a man with his size and strength could do to me, I held my ground. He didn't seem like he was going to aim a punch or kick my way, not when he could so easily simply grab me and force me to go his way. No, he seemed to want my cooperation more than that, and that meant that I had an edge, however small.
Because I swear to you that you can, on my honor.
What's that worth? He pulled back at me as if I had slapped him, and he glared at me. There was something helpless in that look, however, and when he spoke, there was something slow and determined in his voice.
It's worth my name.
I don't understand.
It's all I have left. I am Mal Amel. I am here to protect Illiros. That is all I know about myself, and that is all I have. Will it suffice?
God, what was he going to do if I said no? In the end, I nodded curtly and came to his side. The cynical part of me wanted to call it broken. Knowing broken, there was something lost in his eyes that I didn't want to recognize but echoed in a familiar way. However, there was more than that. Some part of me didn't want to hurt him. It was ludicrous. He was the one who dragged me to some mystical world. He was the one who had almost gotten me eaten by something that once used to be a person. I didn't want to hurt Mal Amel, and I could only dread the consequences of doing so. I could see right away that the city had once been something really special. The walls that surrounded it were high and made of densely translucent marble carved with figures that were beautifully intricate. That must be beautiful in the daylight. I spoke without thinking, and Mal's smile was slightly pained.
I hope I see that again.
What?
There's been no dawn for Illiros for almost 100 years.
I stared at him. That can't be right. That's poetry, right? Metaphor or symbolism, something like that?
It may be a metaphor or symbolism in your world, something for bards and storytellers to play with. Here in Illiro, it is simply fact. There has been no dawn, no day. We live in night with that red moon overhead.
He glared up at the red moon over us, and I did the same. If I had thought about it before, I supposed I would have said that I thought it was pretty. Now I wondered how pretty I might find it if it had replaced the sun entirely. The eternal night wasn't the only thing that had cloaked the country of Illiros in sickening wrongness. We entered the city by a lower drawbridge, our shoes echoing across the wood. Something splashed in the moat surrounding the wall, and I deliberately refused to look at it, afraid that I would see something just as disturbing as the man I had seen in the woods. Once we were in the city itself, I saw a place of immense beauty and charm. It looked like something from a quaint town in untouched Eastern Europe, things well kept up and tidy. There was only one problem. Where are the people? Mal opened his mouth to answer, but then we both heard a step on the cobblestones in front of us. Mal's jaw tightened.
Here, look for yourself.
She was a pretty girl with dark skin and her hair twisted up into two small puffs on top of her head. She wore a gown that my brain thought of as a Jane Austen dress, gathered under her bust and loose to the ground. She would have fit right into the fairy tale world if it hadn't been for the vacant look in her eyes. She walked as if she were in a dream, slowly like a ship listing across becalmed waters. Is she going to attack us like that man did?
Not in town, not usually.
Despite the assurance of his words, Mal kept himself between me and the girl. As she came closer, I could see that her eyes were half open. She was sleepwalking, moving as if she were underwater.
Arnold. I'm looking for Arnold.
Her voice was slurred and dry, and she walked past us without a glance. When she turned a corner and was lost from sight, Mal relaxed slightly.
The city protects them, at least a little. They do not lose everything.
But why? What the hell is happening here? Mal shook his head, and for a moment, I only want to shake him.
I'm not the one to tell you that.
What? What can you tell me then? Anything at all? Or are you just some kind of kidnapper?
He gave me a frustrated look, but he did not give me any more answers. Instead, he turned on his heel and strode off, and with no choice, I followed along behind him, fuming silently.